Welcome, grognards, to this episode of this tutorial series. We're going to be looking at torpedoes, what they're good at, what they're not so good at, and sort of how they all operate. So they're an energy weapon. We've got an Ikaru frigate moving in. It's just firing the torpedoes now, going against this mining station. Let's have a look, have a close look at what happens here, what we should see if everything is working correctly in terms of the way that these will work is that they won't do much damage against the shield. Now there is a small chance that the shields will fail and let the torpedoes through, and then we'll see something interesting happen. So let's have a look and see what actually goes on here. So 6 torpedoes going in against the mining station. They're trying to use their point defense to reduce the power of each torpedo. They're sending their own missiles out over time. Now what happens here? See how there was some of it is getting through. Now of the 6 torpedoes that went in, most of them hit the shielding but didn't do a lot of damage against the shielding. Some of them actually then broke through the shielding and then did damage against the armor. But also have a look at the when I hover over the actual what's gone on there. It's actually gone past the armor as well and done damage directly to a component. There's the defensive component that we see that is damaged is the armor itself. That's what you expect. As soon as armor starts to take damage, you will see that defense line there, the third one down in blue, will then have something in the damage area component. But there's been more damage go through again past the hull and actually has hit one of the internal components. We can see what that is if we just go and have a quick look at the what's going on here. The commerce center is down to 89% because the torpedo got through. Now, what's actually happening here is that the deflection shield generator has, you'll see there, the shield penetration chance there's a 20% chance that it's going to fail. Now, we've got 6 torpedoes going in, which on average, one of them should break through and the shields should fail to the point where they actually don't effectively stop the actual weapon coming into it, no matter what sort of weapon it is. In this case, the torpedo, and then 50% of the damage of the torpedo will then bleed through onto the next layer, which is the armor. And then with the torpedo weapon, there's also then a chance, or not a chance, there's a percentage of that will then bleed through even deeper again. So it'll go past the armor and onto the hull or into the componentry, which is exactly what we've seen there. So shield failure has left to a problem where the commerce center has actually been damaged directly. Torpedoes are great weapons because of this sort of aspect. As shields, as you go through the tech tree, that shield penetration chance will become less and less and less, which means that you've then got to work against the shields. Now, torpedoes are very weak against shields. So if you've got good quality shields, torpedoes are going to struggle. But in this case, 20% is actually good for us in this early stage of the game. So let's have a bit of a look and see what it goes on. Just play this one out a little bit. So it's now firing in. The torpedoes are energy weapons, and so they dissipate over time, so the ship will try to get in close to the actual target. And again, if we look at the 6 that are coming in, if we see any more damage against armor, it means that there's been a failure. Yeah, there's been another failure, and we now see there's even more going in, but the vast majority of them have just been damaging the shield. So they're doing damage to the shield, but some are bleeding past. In this case, we didn't have any other components that got damaged, but we did actually do damage to the hull itself. There we go. Now what's happening here is, we can't see it so much, but the point defense will be trying to, it doesn't intercept and destroy. This is actually a bit of a misconception. I might as well just talk about it now. I will talk about it when I do a video on point defense, but this is a good illustration. What they're trying to do with this beam is to intercept whatever's coming in. In this case, they're intercepting this torpedo, and what it does is every single hit from the Sentinel will take energy off that torpedo, so sort of diminishing what it can actually then go and do. So even though it looks like it's missing, it may still, and there's no way for us to tell really in this, but it is reducing the power of each torpedo hit. Let's just have another look. So we'll keep on having a look. So you can see there they're repairing the hull a little bit. 2 of our torpedoes missed. they're still targeting that torpedo. Now, if they can do enough energy damage, it will then, there we go, all of them have now hit. No more got through that time. Let's just have a bit of a look through. Now it's sort of getting in very, very close now. So it wants to get in nice and close because these are energy weapons. It does dissipate like a lot over distance. So the closer in this can get to the target to do the damage, the better. It's now at a position where there's hardly any distance, and so now it's sort of hitting away. I'll just get rid of that. Just we don't have to deal with it. And we can see now we've almost destroyed the shielding. The shielding is actually still up. So I think there's 2 shields on this one, potentially, I think. Actually, no, there's 2 armor. But eventually we'll sort of break our way through. Now starting to see things going straight through the armor and now doing damage inside. Look how much damage has been done inside the ship. Even though armor is still up, the shielding is, we've still got like the shielding has now been brought down. We now do big damage. And so now we are now ripping into the internals. If we have a look and look inside now, one of the reactors is down. One of that commerce center has taken even more damage, and the large mining engine has also now taken damage as well. So we're bleeding past the armor now and doing damage directly on the inside of the actual of the station. And this is the power of torpedoes. If you can actually have something where where you no longer have, here we go, pirates again, hang on, I'll just get rid of these. Now there's a good chance that the pirates are going to be in this system, so we'll just see how we're going. Again, you'll notice that they also are seeking, like they turn and then they fire in. Again, they're trying to stop what's going on. The shields are trying to come back up again. When the shields are up, it does very limited damage. Now we've broken through. There's still the shields, though, are still operational. So by the time we come back in to do our next volley, which does take a fair bit of time, the shields will possibly have some sort of power in them as well. Actually, no, they haven't. So now we should see massive damage going in. So we're starting to see less and less damage, more and more damage to the componentry. Just leave it there. And now we're destroying components now on the ship itself. So there's a lot of things that are no longer operational. All of the defences are now down. The shielding won't come down as well because we've now disabled that with the torpedoes breaking past the hull and doing sort of direct damage. So the torpedoes are best against armour, but if the shields do fail, they'll then sort of hit the armour and then bypass and do even more damage. They're not great against armour itself. They're good at breaking past the armour and doing damage to the internals past that particular area. Sorry about this, I'll just get rid of that. And we'll just watch what actually goes on here now. So they're just firing away with their torpedoes from the various hard points on the ship, blasting away at it. There's a big, the actual planet itself is way at the back there. This is a moon that it's mining away on. And we'll just watch as it sort of finishes itself off. It's like it won't take too long now. I'll just go back up to a faster speed. It's only half speed now. Torpedoes are often used in small craft as well, like the AI will make good use of them for their bombers, for example. They're a very, very useful weapon. And they're good in combination with other weapons as well, like they're good in combination with, for example, beam weaponry, because the beam weaponry will do good damage against the shielding. So that if you have a complementary weapon to handle the shields, then these will then do the damage sort of deeper into the actual ship itself. This base is now almost completely destroyed, but they're powerful little weapons, and I actually really like them a lot. I've got to say they're one of my favourites. There we go. It's now been destroyed. So there it is. There's our frigate with the torpedoes. Job done. It can now go home, and and in the meantime, we'll talk about the specifics of torpedoes. All right, so here's the actual ship design, and you can see there that they're WST, which puts them in the same standoff category as the missiles. So the missiles and torpedoes are both standoff weapons, and they both happen to be seeking weapons. So if we just hover over the small Epsilon torpedo, we can then just go through the specifics of what this thing actually does do. So it's a standoff weapon. I can't actually point to it as such. standoff weapon at the top there. Its size of 15 is really, really cool. Like it doesn't seem like much, but when you compare it to, for example, the concussion missile, the small concussion missile at 19, it's essentially a fair bit smaller. It's almost 25% smaller, and that means you can usually squeeze more of these onto a ship than you can actual missiles. It doesn't have the range of a missile, which we'll have a look at in just a minute, but it's up there. Other weaponry that is also I guess for comparison, if you have a look at the Thuon beam at 14, they're basically identical. So there's your basic beam weapon. The railgun at 13 is a little bit smaller, but much smaller range. And then the Maxos blaster at 10 is our smallest actual beam weapon, which is actually a fair bit smaller than the torpedo. So it can be useful to have like Maxos blasters filling up space when you've got your torpedoes put onto the actual ship itself. And the Maxos blasters will then do good damage against shields. They'll do full damage against shields. So let's have a look at the other things in this one. It is a seeking weapon, which means that it will change angle. We saw that in the fight. Damage type is just standard impact, so it doesn't do anything tricky. Most of the weapons are standard impact with what they actually do, meaning that they do damage when they hit. That's essentially what they do. It does 35 damage essentially at close range. The maximum it can do is 35. It's got a range of 1680, so it's a fairly long range weapon. We'll compare this in a minute to some of the other weapons, and it does damage at maximum range of 20. So it's almost half the damage, not quite half the damage at maximum range. So you do want to use them at close range. It also then does do a reasonable job of bombardment, which is good as well. So it can be used in all sorts of different crossover areas. It's a bit of a go-to if you need just some sort of hybrid weapon to do different things. It actually is quite good, and we'll compare these when we have a bit of a look. So the point blank accuracy is 80%, and the maximum range accuracy is 70%. So not a hell of a lot of difference. This is at this particular tech level. As we go up the tech levels, it's then going to get better and better with all of these different stats. Weapon countermeasures is plus 52, which is about the same as a missile. So it can be targeted. As you saw, the point defense was actually hitting it. And so of the to put this into perspective, when we were watching what was going on, when it first came out of our ship and started to sort of then, like you saw where they had the sentinel beam actually hitting it came out at 35 energy, or 35 potential damage. The sentinel beam was then hitting it at different times, draining off whatever the power of the sentinel beam was from that 35. Also, as it was traveling, it was then losing, and we'll see there the damage fall off 25% every 1,000 meters. Now, by the time the sentinel beam was hitting it, we were pretty much at point blank, but it was still so we weren't really losing much due to distance, but we were through the sentinel. So by the time it actually hits, that 35 may have been down as low as 5 for all we know. But we don't actually know what the actual amounts were unless we were actually looking specifically at the damage that was done when it actually hit. Anyway, that's sort of how the point defense does work. So starting off at 35 damage when it's at close range is actually very, very good. Now, the other thing we've got, the next little thing we see down through there is the speed, 350 per second. It's slow. It's a slow weapon. The shield bypass, negative 40%. Now, when you see a bypass and you see a negative number, it means essentially that there's the resistance that this weapon has against, like the shields are going to be, like only 60% of the damage is going to be done to shields. So it does mean that when it does hit a shield, 40% of the actual energy of what this thing does is lost. So they're very, very weak against shielding. When you see the next one, armor bypass with a positive number, that means that 60% of the damage still is done to the armor. So it's the same sort of thing. It does 60% of damage to the shield, and it also then does, when it gets through to the actual armor, it'll then do 60% of damage to the armor. But when you have the positive number, the 40% is then passed through to the hull and to the components, which is what we saw in the actual fight itself. So that negative 40 is a problem against the shields. The plus 40 is great because you're going to start to damage important componentry on the ships once the shields are down, or if the shields fail, which is what we saw in our example. So again, bringing the shields down quickly is a good idea. If you then got torpedoes to then really do some damage on the actual ship itself. We'll compare this to all the other different weapon types, because this one is interesting to sort of see how that does compare, for example, against railguns, which are sort of the opposite. So I'll talk a little bit about that when we go in there. Energy per shot is 30, so it is a bit of an energy hog to actually fire, but generally you can see down through here with our energy usage over through this side, we've got more than enough to cope with with firing the weapons with the reactors. It's more the hyperdrive that's actually chewing up most of the actual energy. So again, even though it's a fairly big number of energy required to actually shoot the thing, it's actually not too bad. A firing rate of 12 every 12 seconds is fairly slow, but that's okay, because when it does actually hit, it's doing big damage. The interception as well, it actually does do a fair amount of damage if it can intercept the fighters in seeking. It should show, if you're not sure where it's got the the intercept range is 840. So it's doing whether it's fighting small craft or seeking weapons, it's pretty much the same. Again, you want to use specialist point defense. You don't want to be relying on these. These will miss most of the time when they're actually going against small craft. And again, the intercept energy per shot is still 30, so you're still shooting at it. It's actually a slower rate when it's being used as a point defense weapon. So you only use it as point defense if it's got nothing else to fire at. That's essentially what the AI will do with it. The ship itself will just sort of only fire it if it doesn't actually have a valid, real big target. Okay, and shots per volley with the small is 1. Okay, so if we have a look and compare that with the medium, the only difference here is the very second last line, which is the shots per volley. It's essentially if you've got one hard point and then you put a turret on top of it, the small will just have one turret to fire. So it will have one volley every time it fires. If it's a medium, which is what I actually have on this particular design, the medium torpedo has got 2 turrets to fire. So that's what we're sort of seeing there with the 2 that came out at once, because it does actually have like 2 turrets on the hard point. So that's the only difference in through there. Let's compare it to the small concussion missile. I'll just go through the salient points. Again, you'll sort of see that we already have like a bombard capacity at this stage. There will be a bombard capacity as it goes deeper into what it's doing. So there's a bit of noise outside. You can see there the damage of the Epsilon torpedo at close range is 35 as opposed to 12, but there's more volleys. So there's 4 times the amount of volleys that go in from a missile. But then there's reactive armor, which I need to talk about as well. So we'll talk a little bit about this, because the bang for buck of a torpedo is actually fairly good with what it actually does do. If we go down and have a look at this hull here, what we'll find is when we sort of hover over the hull and armor area, there's a hull reactive rating of 3 and a reactive armor rating of 2. And what that means is that we're actually 5 damage once it actually hits the armor is not used. And so if you're using a missile to do that, it means that the missile, of the 12 that's going in, 5 of that is lost through the reactive armor and the reactive hull plating, essentially. So if it's sort of trying to break through, so only a much smaller percentage is actually then applied as damage. So it becomes a bit of a tricky one. And now, of course, the other big benefit of using a missile is that it doesn't actually dissipate at damage. So each missile carries its full damage, its full payload into the actual target at maximum damage. And so, whereas what we sort of find with the torpedoes is that they do dissipate a lot at maximum range. And so, in that sense, what we end up having to sort of then consider is our ship going to be mainly used at long range? Do we want it to stay away and really be a standoff weapon? Or don't we mind it sort of moving in and doing closer damage against weaker targets, for example? And so quite often, if you're using a torpedo, it'll be a slightly more aggressive ship than if you're using a missile. The missile is really a full standoff weapon, whereas a torpedo, strictly speaking, really isn't, even though it's in that category. Other things to consider with this is, well, not much else really. I mean, it's the volleys between missiles is 32 seconds as opposed to 12 seconds for the torpedoes. I actually really like the torpedoes, to be honest. I'll only use missiles on ships where I really need the distance. Actually, that's the other thing. The range of a missile can be fired at longer range than that of a torpedo, and so the missiles will tend to will be the longest range weapons in the game. Let's have a look at the Maxos blaster as an example, or probably the Thuon beam. This is more of a full-on beam, which is about the same size. We're not going to see much difference in through there, other than the fact that the damage is going to, like, the range will be much smaller for a beam weapon, particularly if we do go to the Maxos blaster. The Maxos blaster has only got a range of 990, so not quite half the range. But again, it's useful because it doesn't have that limitation of the shields. Like a Maxos blaster will do damage to the shields, and you can see there the damage of a Maxos blaster when it is sort of working at even at maximum range or at small range, is still going to do reasonable damage to the shield. So if you're using it to work in conjunction with the torpedo to sort of get extra damage done, Maxos blaster is a very, very good choice because of its size, and also because it doesn't actually have any of that negative aspect about getting through the shield. So they can work very, very well in harmony together. The next one we'll have a look at is the railgun. So there's the railgun. Again, the railgun is about half the range of the torpedo. It has the opposite problem, or not problem, but opposite aspect, where it does very well at bypassing shields. It doesn't do damage against the shields as such. So putting a torpedo and a railgun on the same ship is actually still not going to get you past your shields much more effectively. But what it does is it then bypasses the shields and hits the armor. And you don't really need a torpedo and a railgun on the same ship. They don't really enhance each other. I think it's much better to have a weapon that does good damage against shields, whereas a railgun, when it does actually hit a shield, 60% of the damage of the railgun is done to the shield, 40% goes past. Now, you don't need that as such, because when you do get your torpedoes working, they're going to be bypassing the armor anyway. So going through the shields to do damage to the armor is of no real great consequence. So in that sort of sense, I like using railguns a lot. I like using torpedoes a lot, but I don't like using them together because you still don't get the benefit of the damage to the shield using the railgun. And if you're using torpedoes, you want those shields down as fast as possible. So does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So I wouldn't use these together. They don't. It's not as if the differences between the railgun being good against shields or good at bypassing shields and the Epsilon torpedo being bad at shields. It doesn't cancel itself out. In both cases, only 60% get through the shields, or actually is damage to the shields. So anyway, they're not the greatest to use together, and that's about it, I think, in terms of what we sort of have in through here as far as considering what to do with them. Again, the torpedo is just a good all-round weapon. Like, the fact that it does bombardment damage, reasonable bombardment damage as well. They're nothing at all like the. We can't use it. I've chosen the Ikaru, which actually don't have bombardment weapons, but a full bombardment weapon will do a lot more damage. But just in general, if you're needing to sort of bombard something, you can actually use these to do it. The torpedoes, I do like them a lot, like a hell of a lot. I would have to say probably my favourite weapon. They'd be up there. They would be up there. I really do like them a lot. I mean, I change over time as well with what I like about weaponry. But I know a lot of people prefer missiles over torpedoes because they deliver the full damage at the point of impact. But the problem with that, again, just to reiterate, it's only 12 damage per torpedo. Reactive armor, reactive hull plating is going to diminish that a fair amount unless you've got high impact. Whereas the Epsilon torpedo, you've got less of them going in, but they're doing more damage when they hit, and that's impactful. That's meaningful. Combine them again with the big 16 damage of a Maxos blaster, you've got something really quite good. Anyway, I'll leave it there for this episode. I don't think there's anything else we needed to talk about. sorry, and also combined with that small size, a smallish size in comparison to some of the other weaponry, is really quite nice. I'll leave it there. I'll catch you next time. I don't know what I'll do for the next one. I may do point defense. I'll have to think about it. I'll catch you next time.